Entius vajo, shared command in the formal sense. Ancient narrative sources emphasize their differing temperaments. Paulus, cautious and measured. Varro, bold, sometimes impulsive. But modern scholarship, see Adrian Goldsworthy's work for a careful reading of the sources, warns against simplistic psychologizing. Command in the Roman Republican system was a political as well as a military arrangement. On the day of battle, the pace and pattern of events would be shaped by those institutional realities as much as by personalities. The Roman line, composed of maniples, small tactical subunits arranged in a checkerboard fashion, depended on close order fighting, coordinated thrusts of massed infantry, and the expectation that one push could shatter an opposing front. The terrain between the armies mattered. A band of river and low ridges lay to the Roman rear and right. The ground in front was relatively open and flat, favorable to the Romans' plan of a head-on shock. Hannibal chose his ground with care. Polybius and Livy record that he deliberately narrowed his center and strengthened his wings, a disposition that modern analysts interpret as an invitation. Entice the enemy to press in the center, then use superior cavalry and more reliable wings to crush the flanks. If that reading is correct, what looked like a concession in the center was a calculated gamble, a deliberate elasticity that could absorb pressure and convert it into a trap. Before full contact, probes and skirmishes set the tone. Light troops, slingers, javelin men, skirmishing velites, Roman light infantry, tested each other's range and resolve. The sound of these exchanges was not constant, but intermittent. The sharp whistle of a slingstone, the clatter of light javelins, voices shouted and answered in a dozen languages. These are the details that often escape summary, yet they were the small threads that braided together the larger pattern. An Iberian slinger kneels on dusty soil to steady his aim. A Roman velice, likely a younger, lighter-armed soldier, steps forward and throws a pilum, javelin, watches its arc, and then tucks himself behind the rim of a shield. Such moments were the currency of attrition and morale long before the main lines converged. When the main clash came, it began as a collision of frontage and weight. The Roman advance was relentless. Their officers urged them forward with the blunt commands drilled into the legions, and the mass of soldiers closed to spear length. The Carthaginian center, composed largely of Gauls and Spaniards in staggered depth, yielded slowly in the face of Roman pressure. Here the narrative must be careful. The center did not grind and dissolve instantly. It gave in a measured fashion, drawing the Roman momentum inward. This yielding was the hinge of Hannibal's plan, if indeed the sources record his intention correctly. The center's apparent retreat created an ever-tightening curve, a crescent that would later be described as a concave position.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era would later be described as a concave position. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Shortly after contact, the cavalry actions on the wings began to come into focus. On the Carthaginian right, the Numidian light cavalry skirmished with Roman allies, harrying and attempting to throw off balance. On the left, the heavier Punic cavalry, better armed and more cohesive, engaged the Roman equites. Here, Polybius's account suggests decisive superiority for Hannibal's cavalry. Modern interpretation hedges the absolute edge, but generally concurs. Carthaginian cavalry, especially under Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother or relative depending on the source, were likely more effective on the day, capable of defeating Roman horsemen and then sweeping to the rear. Consider a single cavalryman among the Numidians. You feel the thin leather beneath you, the lightness that allows rapid turns. Your horse has learned to answer your hip and weight more than your rein. The terrain kicks up dust in clouds that beget mirage. You dart forward, lose a javelin at a Roman auxiliary, swing away before heavy lances can find you. The aim is not to stay and slug it out, but to pull, prod, and then vanish into the haze. These riders shape the envelope. They are the fingers before the hand closes. As the Roman center pushed deeper, the Carthaginian wings, the heavier infantry composed of disciplined Libyans and veteran African troops, began to pivot inward. The geometry of the field changed not in sudden theatrical motions, but in a sequence of small rotations and advances that, together, created a ring closing around the Roman force. The Roman lines were dense and deep, and their very density worked against them once their front faced envelopment from multiple quarters. Where a mass can press forward with near unstoppable effect, it cannot pivot fast enough to meet attacks from its flanks and rear. Hannibal's cavalry had a role that was both opportunistic and planned. After besting the Roman horse on the wings, a process that Polybius suggests was relatively swift and possibly decisive, the Carthaginian cavalry did not linger in pursuit, but wheeled to attack the Roman rear. This maneuver, moving from exterior victory to interior devastation, is the moment that modern analysts identify as the decisive envelopment. In terms of timing, the cavalry's return to strike the Roman rear had to be coordinated with the inward folding of the Carthaginian infantry wings. Both elements needed to be well timed. If the cavalry struck too early or too late, the Roman mass might have broken through or reformed into a defensive posture. Hannibal's experience and command culture likely minimized such errors, but historians must treat precise synchrony as plausible rather than certain. On the Roman side, command decisions exacerbated the vulnerability. Varro, entrusted with daily command according to Roman custom that rotated duties, continued an aggressive prosecution of the assault.
The consensus view frames Cannae as a tactical masterpiece of envelopment, enabled by superior cavalry performance and a willing center that surrendered ground to draw in an overconfident enemy. When one tries to picture the closing moments, restraint in description must guide tone. The ground became littered with those who had fallen. A pall of dust and the shadows of broken standards marked the scene. The noise, too, changed, from the sharp clashes of combat to a lower, more desperate cacophony. Cries for help, the groaning of wounded men, the muffled thud of bodies. The scale of loss was immense. Ancient tallies, Polybius suggests figures that modern scholars debate, place Roman dead in the tens of thousands, with many more captured. Modern estimates vary. Some place Roman dead at around 50,000 to 70,000, while Carthaginian losses appear far smaller, perhaps a few thousand. These numbers are approximations and must be treated as such. The true tragedy lies not just in statistics, but in the human reality behind them. In the aftermath, some Roman survivors attempted to escape across the Aufidus River. The river, whose banks had been a geographic boundary, became a grim funnel. Those who reached the water faced overcrowded fords, the confusion of retreat, and sometimes death by drowning or capture. Hannibal's troops, though victorious, were not in a position to chase every fleeing man into distant hinterlands. Their victory was tactical and immediate, not a logistical elimination of Roman power. The Carthaginian army's inability to press deeper strategic advantage after the victory owed as much to supply, politics, and strategic caution as to any lack of will. Throughout the day, the role of subordinate commanders and unit cohesion proved decisive. Hasdrubal's cavalry on the left wing, as recorded in the sources, and the Numidian horse on the right performed not just as shock elements, but as coordinators of timing. The Libyan infantry held well enough to pivot inward and complete the envelopment. The veteran quality of many Carthaginian units, soldiers who had been tested in previous campaigns, contrasted with the mixed quality of the Roman assemblage, which included many hastily levied men and allied contingents. Again, this is a point scholars emphasize with caveats. The Roman legions had formidable discipline and could win in many circumstances, but at Cannae those qualities were insufficient to counter the geometric encirclement that unfolded. Expert commentary often returns to the question of innovation versus adaptation. Some historians portray Cannae as a moment of tactical genius, Hannibal's masterstroke. Others, more cautiously, emphasize that Hannibal exploited specific circumstances, Roman command choices, terrain, and the performance of his cavalry, rather than inventing a brand new tactic. The modern military scholar tends to describe the event as a near-perfect execution of combined arms envelopment. Infantry drew and pinned, cavalry defeated counterparts and then attacked the rear, forming a mechanical closure that converted local successes into strategic annihilation. A final set of human vignettes helps to lock the scale into the reader's memory. A Roman centurion, stripped of his command by events, took a small group of men and tried to make a hole through the ring, throwing the weight of experience into a desperate shove. A Balearic slinger, perched on an anthill, watched the movement of the Roman mass and picked targets with the practiced calm of a marksman. His slingstones found gaps and eyes, but the larger process of envelopment was beyond any hand to arrest. A young Roman recruit, pressed into service moments earlier and bewildered by the collapse, remembered the shout of a magistrate who had pointed to victory and now saw that shout cut short by the new grammar of battlefield failure. Even as the day closed, some elements of the fight persisted. Isolated pockets of resistance, the retrieval of standards, the burial of the dead where practical, and the counting of losses. The Roman polity would not disappear, it would learn and adapt. Hannibal's victory at Cannae was brilliant and ruinous to Roman manpower in the short term, but its long-term consequences were complex and far from determinative of the war's ultimate outcome. For the immediate present, however, the field near Cannae lay under a sky dimmed by dust and the heavy knowledge of defeat. As light fell, commanders on both sides had to confront the logistical and political consequences of what had occurred. Hannibal could claim a decisive tactical victory. He had humiliated a Roman army and extracted a heavy toll. Yet strategic options were constrained by supply lines, the loyalty of Italian allies, and the broader political game. On the Roman side, the Senate and magistrates faced the moral necessity of raising new armies, reorganizing command, and confronting a political shock that would test the resilience of the Republic. Ancient historians dwell on speeches and moral interpretations after such calamities. Modern interpretation prefers to read these as parts of recovery and renewal rather than as emotional catharses. There is, too, an important methodological caveat. Our understanding rests on sources written by those who had agendas, gaps, and sometimes conflicting testimony. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, sought to be analytical and to use eyewitness material when available. Livy, writing later, prized narrative and moral lessons. Modern excavations and logistical modeling offer additional constraints and lend nuance. They do not, however, convert the event into an arithmetic certainty. Careful readers should accept both the grandeur of the tactical achievement and the uncertainty of precise numbers and motivations.
Night brought a hush that was not peace, but the exhausted quiet of men who had run out of breath and blood. The field keepers and survivors moved among the dead and dying, the recitation of names and ranks mingling with the practical work of securing standards. Hannibal's camp smelled of roasted meat and the oil used to tend wounded animals. The Carthaginian officers met to account for their own casualties and to plan the days ahead, aware that victory had consequences that required management and forethought if it were to yield strategic advantage. For Rome, the loss at Cannae was a wound that would yet yield the Republic's capacity for recovery. Recruitment would surge. Consular authority would be adjusted. New commanders would learn harsh lessons about flexibility and reserves. The psychological blow was immense, but Rome's institutions permitted it to absorb defeats and reorganize. Hannibal's tactical triumph illuminated the vulnerability of massed frontal assaults when faced with coordinated envelopment and superior cavalry, a lesson military thinkers would study for millennia. Still, the human picture remains what resonates most forcefully. The men who fought were not abstractions. They were sons, fathers, neighbors, veterans of previous campaigns and fresh recruits, commanders balancing pride and fear. The dust that rose at Cannae obscured faces and names, but it did not erase individual experiences. The centurion who refused to retreat, the slinger who turned a desperate aim into a protective small glory, the young Hastatus whose last thought may have been of home. Any account that reduces them to statistics alone misses the moral center of the event. The geometry of Cannae, center yielding, wings folding, cavalry sweeping, has become a staple of military instruction. Terms like double envelopment or Cannae model are used in textbooks and lectures, always with the same hedging. Context matters. On the field itself, the moment-to-moment decisions, the physical stamina of horses and men, the temperament of subordinate leaders, and the grit of individuals, all combined to produce a catastrophe for Rome and a signal triumph for Hannibal. How those elements combined remains the central fascination and the central challenge for anyone trying to reconstruct the scene from fragments of testimony and the archaeology of battle. As the activity on the plain receded into evening, one could imagine a map being traced in the dirt. Lines of advance, pockets of resistance, broken circuits where units had fragmented. That map, an ephemeral arrangement of movement and human will, is what continues to teach. The Roman teacher who later showed pupils where formations had bent and collapsed was not only instructing about past failure, but also passing along a lesson in the mechanics of war. No formation, no matter how disciplined, is immune to being turned into a trap if foe and field combine against it.
And yet, even as the immediate drama wound down, questions remained. How many men would be left to oppose Hannibal in the months that followed? Which Italian cities would change allegiance under the pressure of fear or calculation? Could Hannibal, brilliant in the tactical sphere, convert battlefield victories into a strategic collapse of Rome's power in Italy? These are large questions whose answers would unfold in campaigns, sieges, and politics beyond a single day on the plain. At the close of the first day's reconstruction, one may pause to reflect on the mechanics of the envelopment once more. The center's yielding created a concavity that invited Roman momentum. The heavier Carthaginian infantry on the wings held and rotated inward, and the cavalry, after defeating their counterparts, struck the rear, completing the ring. Each step had to be timed and relied on units that could perform under pressure. The capacity of Hannibal to orchestrate these moves, according to many historians, demonstrates not merely luck, but tactical mastery and a deep understanding of the morale and psychology of opposing armies. The survivors, on both sides, would carry memories of the day beyond the tactical and into the personal. Some Roman survivors reportedly wandered back toward their homes, seeking refuge. Some Carthaginian soldiers guarded standards and tended horses, speaking in their languages of what had been done. The music of trumpet and the shrill of signals would, for a while, be retuned to other tasks, tending wounded, burying the dead, and preparing for what came next. The field at Cannae would remain a touchstone in military memory, an example of how combined arms, geometry, and timing could turn a superior numerical force into a catastrophe. It would also remain a reminder of the human cost. In reconstructing the day, historians must balance admiration for tactical brilliance with sobriety about the slaughter it produced. The lesson for readers and students of warfare is twofold. Understand the mechanics and never forget the people whose lives those mechanics consumed. Even now, after hours of narrative and reconstruction, the day is not fully closed. There remains the immediate aftermath, pursuit, the fate of prisoners, the response of allies and enemies alike, and the political and logistical decisions that would shape the months to come. The plain of Cannae had given a lesson that would be read and reread. But the story's final panels, the strategic reverberations across Italy, and the long oscillation of the Second Punic War require further attention, for they are part of the larger sweep that defines the conflict between Rome and Hannibal. Hannibal did not linger on the plain to watch Rome unriddle itself in panic. Marching on Rome and then failing would have been the worst of outcomes. The better bet was to consolidate power in the south and to let attrition and diplomacy do the rest. The months that followed were therefore a mixture of campaigning and political contest. Hannibal maneuvered through Apulia and Campania, accepting the hospitality of cities that came to him and placing garrisons where he judged necessary. The Romans, meanwhile, raised new armies. They sent commanders to contest Hannibal's forays, to harass his supply lines, and to prevent the consolidation of his southern gains. The war in Italy thus assumed a new shape. It ceased to be a series of pitched battles and became a long contest of attrition, alliance-making, forts and counter-forts, raids and counter-raids. The very land of Italy became an instrument of warfare. Its roads, its granaries, its coastal ports. Economics, often neglected in grand narratives of warfare, here had immediate salience. Grain supplies mattered as much as tactical brilliance. Sicily, with its fertile lands and powerful grain exports, assumed strategic value. Roman efforts to secure supply routes and to cultivate support from Sicilian and other Mediterranean powers were part of the broader reaction. The maintenance of fleets, the protection of convoys, and the negotiation with provincial potentates were chapters in the wider contest. Food shortages, moreover, forced cities and armies to make hard choices. Requisitions, proportional levies, and the redirecting of civilian stores to feed troops. Such measures tested loyalties and fed resentments, but they also gave Rome the ability to keep fighting. Politically, the war produced new strains within Rome. Questions of command, accusations of cowardice or hubris, and the assignment of blame moved through the Senate and the assemblies. Some commanders who had been associated with defeat were sidelined. New men rose, learned through the pain of experience or through the opportunism that war rewards. The Roman political mechanism, its consuls, proconsuls, and legates, adapted, sometimes awkwardly, to the prolonged crisis. Ideas about command rotated. Cautious policies of delay and avoidance of open battle, associated with the earlier cunctator approach, contended with the pressure of public expectation for decisive action. The balance between prudence and the need to restore honor became a persistent theme in Roman deliberations. For Hannibal, too, politics in Italy complicated his military calculus. Each city that declared for him improved his position, but each new ally also required accommodation, assurances of autonomy or special status, and often protection from Roman reprisals. The Carthaginian command had to manage local notables, to honor their municipal institutions where practicable, and to sustain the belief that alliance with Carthage offered more advantage than continued fidelity to Rome. In this, the south of Italy proved fertile terrain. Long-standing local grievances with Roman dominance made the prospect of change attractive. Yet, in other quarters, in the central Italian territories, among many Latin colonies, the Roman brand of citizenship and the legal ties of association still had purchase. The Italian mosaic did not flip like an instant switch. It moved in patches and phases. The balance of warfare, therefore, shifted into the domains of attrition and politics. Hannibal's strategy of inducing defections had immediate success in Campania and in parts of Lucania and Bruttium. Rome's response, austere and unyielding, was to fortify the loyalty that remained and to try to isolate Hannibal's gains. Military engagements continued, smaller in scale sometimes, large in others, but they were increasingly about denying the other side resources and time. Skirmishes, sieges of fortified towns, and the guarding of communications became the daily business of generals on both sides. Beyond the fields and the towns, the war had a human texture that must not be elided by the larger movements of armies. Families were broken, estates were pillaged, entire neighborhoods were disrupted by the passage of troops and the decision of civic leaders to favor one side or another. Refugees moved toward walled towns, some fled to the countryside, and others were taken into the protective custody of relatives or patron-client networks. The social fabric of many regions was rent by the war's pressures. Landlords lost labor, merchants lost markets, and slaves sometimes found new opportunities in the disorder. The human costs of Cannae thus propagated outward in time and space, affecting demographics, economics, and civic life in ways that would be felt for generations. What followed was a protracted struggle of attrition punctuated by moments of daring. Rome would in time find leaders who operated with a strategic imagination of their own, and who could turn the war's pressures against Carthage's broader interests. Hannibal, for his part, would press his advantage in Italy with the skill that had made Cannae a textbook lesson. But the stage that unfolded after that one great day revealed an essential truth about ancient warfare. A single battlefield triumph, however spectacular, must be coupled to political instruments and logistical capacities to convert victory into absolute conquest. Hannibal, brilliant as he was, found himself operating within the limits of what an invading commander could sustain on hostile soil. As the season cycled, so too did campaigns. The armies dispersed from static lines into roving columns. Winter quarters were established and supply depots tended. Envoys were sent and received. Rome's Senate, exhausted yet unbowed, set priorities: to defend the core, to recover essential towns, and to keep the machinery of war running.
Hannibal, shrewd and opportunistic, sought to exploit every local opportunity to weaken Rome's alliances. The second phase of the war was thus less a sequence of great battles than a long contest for hearts, cities, and the ability to feed and pay men in the field. In the historiographical aftermath, ancient writers and later commentators would read Cannae in different keys. Some celebrated the tactical genius that had produced the envelopment. Others lamented the scale of slaughter and the squandered chances for diplomatic resolution. Modern analysts, reading the fragments of sources and the archaeology of the region, have emphasized contingency. The role of individual commanders' temperament, the weather on the day, the fatigue of units, and the unpredictable human behaviors that turn lines of men into instruments of catastrophe. Yet, whatever the interpretive frame, the day's central lesson remained unchanged. Warfare is at once technical and moral. It is geometry on earth and life in motion, with consequences that resonate long after trumpets fall silent. There is, in the slow aftermath of Cannae, a quieter story that is less often told because it lacks the spectacle of envelopment and slaughter: the story of resilience. Rome's institutions, for all their flaws, contained within them an extraordinary capacity for renewal. Men who had survived the field were rearmed. The state found resources in unexpected places. The social order bent but did not break. This was not a consequence of inevitability. It was the result of choices, harrowing, costly, and sometimes ruthless choices made by communities and leaders determined to endure. And Hannibal, for the moment triumphant, learned also the limits. His presence in Italy would haunt Roman memory and shape Roman strategy for years. Yet his absence of a capital siege train, his distance from Carthage's full diplomatic resources, and the stubbornness of Roman political will combined to make his victory at Cannae the opening act rather than the final curtain of the war.
The months to come would be full of deft maneuvers, of sieges and blockades, of shifting alliances, and of the slow arithmetic of supply and attrition. To understand the Second Punic War fully, one must therefore read Cannae not as an endpoint, but as a hinge, a moment that pivoted the conflict into a longer, more complex contest in which strategy, logistics, and politics would have to do the heavy lifting that battlefield brilliance alone could not accomplish. As autumn gave way to the colder months, Hannibal moved deeper into Campania and established winter quarters that allowed him to consolidate the loyalties he had won and to refresh his army. He placed garrisons in key towns, negotiated with local elites, and prepared for another campaign season. Rome, on its part, closed ranks, issued edicts to maintain supply lines, and dispatched legions to secure crucial positions in central Italy and along the coast.